Welcome back. Patch 6.2 drops this Tuesday, June 23rd. So I wanted to talk about WatcherDev's response to the Q&A. There were a couple of points that he wanted to clarify and some questions that he wanted to answer that didn't make it in the Q&A. Now the footage that you're seeing in the background is just random footage of me doing quests in my goal to unlock flying when it becomes available, so I'm doing the lore master stuff. So this is more of a video that's about listening more so than watching. So let's get into this. This is WatcherDev's response, and I will have a link in the description so that you can view it yourself. I had a great time doing the Q&A this past weekend, and I look forward to more opportunities to speak directly with the community and field your questions. I wanted to take some time to clarify a couple of my responses. I'd also like to address several questions that were in the queue, but which we weren't able to reach before we ran out of time. The infamous Demonology Warlock response. We've heard from many players that they don't enjoy the spec, but feel pressured to play because it has been so clearly the all-around best Warlock spec in current rating. And we've seen masses of Warlocks who started out favoring affliction or destruction, migrating steadily towards demonology. We feel the spec has several elements that are awkward and unintuitive. That's not just a matter of sheer complexity. It's fine for some specs to be more challenging to play optimally, especially for pure DPS, where players can choose to opt into that complexity while having alternatives available. And we have plans to rework and hopefully improve the spec, but those changes are beyond the scope of a patch. In the meantime, we want to make sure that we are alleviating the pressure to play demonology over other specs, which means making sure that it is the best Warlock spec. The goal of our 6.2 changes is not to make demonology terrible or unplayable, and I'd expect demonology to still be quite competitive on some types of encounters, and viable everywhere. If it isn't, we'll make further adjustments to compensate. But we did intentionally make changes to ensure that it isn't the single best Warlock spec in patch 6.2, and I wanted to make it clear that this was our intent rather than simply a mathematical error. The issue that I have, where he said, we have plans to rework and hopefully improve the spec, but those changes are beyond the scope of a patch. Then just wait. Because to me, unless these changes are the bomb, then that's just going to frustrate players even more and take something. I'm not saying that it's fun, but I just think that it will cause more frustration, so we'll see. Healing priests. In the Q&A, I fielded a question about absorbs and have seen feedback about a seeming contradiction between our stance on demonology warlocks. We don't want our warlocks to feel obligated to play demo, so we're nerfing demo. And my comments about disc. You're probably doing it wrong if you only have one priest in the raid and it isn't disc. Okay. To be clear, we don't think that the current state of priest-healer representation is a desirable one. I was describing the present reality, not stating our design goal, but the discipline problem isn't one that is solvable with a simple numbers change. We'd have to nerf discipline to the point of complete usefulness in order to meaningfully affect their representation. The issues lie in their nature as an absorb-based healer, offering a unique benefit that neither Holy Priest nor any other healer can provide, and often doing so at the expense of the fun of other healers, whose core gameplay lies in refilling health bars that now empty less or not at all due to absorbs. Absorbs are still interesting as a mechanic, and we're not looking to prevent disc from feeling unique, but the spec's niche is multi-healer. In multi-healer situations, probably shouldn't be mechanically blanketing allies with absorbs. In short, we acknowledge that there's a problem, but we don't have a solution to discuss yet, which is what I think they should be doing about warlocks. So it should be interesting to see what these changes are. Now, Lore gave me a list of questions that we didn't get to on Saturday, and I'd like to take a stab at answering a few more. Some of these are things that I could probably ramble on about for pages, but I'll try to stay concise and keep the responses in line with the content of the rest of the Q&A. So the question: how has itemization in WoD worked out thus far? Are you happy with the new stats, bonus, gear, properties, enchants? Answer: overall, we are happy with how most of the changes have played out. Bonus gear properties in particular keep farm content potentially rewarding and create some extra moments of excitement as designed. Tertiary stats are too weak initially, but since the 6.1 changes are in a good place, I've seen people get more excited for a huge speed or avoidance bump on a primary gear slot than they would have been over a socket, which is pretty cool. As far as stats goes, and this may surprise players somewhat, we're pretty satisfied with how versatility has turned out. It's a simple baseline stat that's easy to understand and has some depth in it, especially in PvP. It may not be the favorite stat of any damage-dealing raiders, but that's okay. It has a solid baseline. Multi-strike is probably the weakest of our current stats from a design perspective. Mechanically, it's very similar to crit, except where we've added specific class mechanics to hook into it and bolster it as a stat. There may be a visceral feel at times to firing extra missiles, but when you're firing a ton of projectiles all the time, that also comes at the expense of lessening the impact of each individual missile and cast. Okay. Question: any other plans for another stat squish? This one didn't seem to do much. Well, the answer is, players are currently dealing damage roughly on par with what we saw at the end of Dragon Soul almost 4 years ago, which is fairly significant. If not for the squish, we'd be seeing DPS values in the millions, player health well into the millions, gear having 5-digit amounts of each stat, and so forth. So the squish did quite a bit. Experience has shown, however, that if a full tier of gear doesn't increase player stats by at least 10 to 15%, upgrades feel unrewarding. The compounding nature of that growth does mean that numbers will get unwieldy over time. We don't see the need for another stat squish in the very near future, but we'll likely end up doing one again eventually. I think that it's a good point that players don't really feel it, but yet and still it happens, so I think that that's a good balance. Question: will the kick tool be improved to be less prone to abuse? Answer: the vote to kick system in our group finder is definitely due for some improvements. The system was designed alongside with original introduction to the LFG tool, looking for group, years ago, in a world where the default loot method was need greed and a major issue was people abusing the kick feature to eliminate competition for loot. Nowadays, there are far fewer selfish motivations for initiating a kick, so it makes sense for us to reevaluate that design. In Raid Finder in particular, one person who is griefing is having a negative impact on the gameplay experience of up to 24 other players, and we should make sure we're weighing the protections provided by the system accordingly. We are working on making some subtle adjustments to the logic involved that should address some of these issues. For example, just because we're in combat doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to kick someone who deserves it. That restriction should be in place to prevent loot abuse, but now loot is mailed to players who aren't around to receive it. We'll continue to keep an eye on the system and make additional tweaks aimed at reducing player frustration. Okay. Question: when will elemental enhancement shamans get the rework we deserve? Totems are so outdated and irrelevant. Answer: totems could definitely use some love. I'm not sure the core rotations of either spec need an outright rework, though there are certainly some issues where they say elemental ascendants being numerically underwhelming and enhancement having so many different sources of damage that few individual button presses feel rewarding. Totems historically provided irreplaceable benefits, for example Wind Fury providing extra attacks, that were balanced by the spatial constraint of being tied to a killable totem in a fixed location. Now that drawback often feels unwarranted. There isn't much that's cool about an ability like Searing Totem. Powerful effects like Earth Grab, Wind Walk, or Healing Tide fare better, but that isn't a very long list. We agree that totems need to be either overhauled as a mechanic or that their importance to the shaman class needs to be reduced. Okay, question. What do fire and frost mages, elemental shamans, have mana bars for? Will mana matter again at some point? For many hybrid casters, mana is little more than a constraint on ability to heal, allowing for hybrid off-heals to be potent, but limiting their sustainability so that they clearly fall short of a dedicated healer. Beyond that, we agree. There isn't much point to the resource for several specs. Mana works well as a healer resource, where mana management and efficiency are designed to be a core part of every healer's gameplay, some specs current situation notwithstanding. But we have moved away from having it as a meaningful constraint on DPS output, because it generally served as a frustrating constraint in a world where many, if not most other DPS specs were not similarly constrained. Arcane mages stand as an exception, but they have a toolkit specifically designed around controlling their mana pools. I don't think we're likely to return to a world where elemental shamans can run themselves out of mana and end up unable to cast lightning bolt. But perhaps there are more interesting things that could be done with DPS resource bars in place of mana. Question. Complex encounter design positioning is being trivialized by player-created tools. Are there plans to curb this? Answer. Clever players have been using add-ons to assist with raid coordination since the earliest days of WoW raiding. When these add-ons have crossed a line and approached automating player activity or decision-making entirely, we have stepped in to disable or limit the underlying functionality that made that possible. Beyond that, players' ability to use mods to help keep track of non-random abilities isn't particularly concerning. As a raider myself, I downloaded Thogar Assist as a reference, I hope I'm saying that right, but found that by the time my guild defeated the encounter, I had long since memorized the train schedule. It is something for us to keep in mind, however, and we do occasionally alter our designs when we realize that a mod could completely trivialize the intended gameplay. Chromog, for example, could have had another dozen or so spawn points and randomly picked a subset of them each phase, preventing any sort of fixed one-to-one assignment. Question. Legacy buff for mop content, Mr. Pandaria. When? Answer. Never. Or at least not until next time we do a stat squish, technically. The legacy buff that applies to enemies below level 90, once you exceed that level, was designed specifically and solely to offset the 6.0 stat squish, which compressed the exponential scaling in the items available from level 61 to 90 into linear scaling. Pre-squish, a level 90 player with Pandaria gear was literally a dozen times more powerful than they had been at level 80 with Wrath gear. Post-squish, that is no longer the case. So we have a special combat modifier in place to preserve the expected gameplay so that soloing old content does not become harder. Gear higher than item level 463 wasn't squished. So endgame miss content designed to be tackled by players of that power level wasn't affected, and no combat scaler is needed. Missed content, it will increasingly become doable with fewer players than intended as player power continues to rise, as has always been the case. People already are soloing large chunks of missed content, and that goal will only become more and more attainable as time goes on and gear continues to improve. And that's the way that it should be. I mean, the whole point in this game and in an RPG is that you evolve and become stronger and more powerful, you know, if that's one of your goals. So you should be able to just pwn content as you scale up the older content, in my opinion. So, question. Will hunters and mages get a new raid utility in 6.2? Answer. No. At this point, while we may still be making numerical adjustments, I wouldn't expect new abilities or class functionality in 6.2. We moved Aspect of the Fox from hunters because they simply did not need it to be unique, viable, or in fact highly desired. it also contributed to elevating ranged classes above melee in many cases by offsetting one of the caster's main weaknesses. One of the strengths of melee classes is that they can move along with their target and continue to deal full damage while on the move, while most casters' throughput suffers if they can't stand still. In encounter design, we created mechanics and phases with this constraint in mind, with the expectation that a ranged heavy raid will have its throughput suffer during something like Hansguard or Franzok's stamping presses phase or Blackhand's massive demolitions. Each additional aspect of the Fach eroded this natural melee advantage and contributed to raid composition and balance issues. Even without Fox, Hunters are unique in that they are the only ranged DPS that can do nearly everything while on the move, which naturally makes them well suited to specialized roles on a number of encounters, aside from naturally thriving in high movement environments. On top of that, deterrence, feign death, misdirection, and disengage all allow them to assist with handling mechanics in ways that many other classes cannot. As for mages, Amplify was not nearly as impactful, but neither was it necessary to justify the inclusion of a class that already brings a versatile toolset, burst damage, control, and useful immunities. A particularly odd feature of both aspect of the Fox and Amplify magic is that neither ability had apparent use whatsoever when solo, which contributed to their awkwardness. In short, we added those abilities in 6.0 because we were concerned that mages and hunters might not be well represented without some new and unique raid cooldown, but having observed how they have played in practice, those concerns were likely unfounded, leaving us with two niche abilities at the time where we have otherwise been trying to streamline the contents of class spellbooks, thus we're removing them in 6.2. And that's the end of that. I'd like to know your thoughts on it. I've sort of said mine in between. As regards to hunters, it goes along with the theme of the priests and the warlocks. I think that some of these things should not be touched in 6.2. I think that there are other more pressing things that I wish they would have addressed, like fixing PvP. But then again, the answer might have been, well, you know what? This is something that's not really addressable in a patch. In which case, you know, when are we fixing this? In an expansion? I don't know. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is that there was a lot of talk about how light 6.1 was. I just want to throw it out there that maybe 6.1 was so light because the development team was at odds on what path to go down, particularly with flying. How are you supposed to design and create content if you can't agree on what that content is supposed to have? So now, to me, it's starting to make sense why some of these patches are so light, or why the content is so light. And now, what I'm hoping is that since firm plans have been made, and the decision has been made, and this is how it's going to be going into the future, they can get back to giving players the quality content that they deserve. And I honestly think that the company does want to do better than what it's doing. I just think that internal issues, and I have no proof of this, but I think that I just don't see how you can create content when you can't even agree on the foundation of that content. So, oh, one other thing that I want to mention. While I said that I don't particularly have a problem with the way that flying is going to be unlocked, and I don't. Like, for example, some of these things are things that I wanted to do anyway, so this doesn't apply to me. Please keep in mind that some players are feeling frustrated because if they had known that these requirements would be necessary, they could have knocked this out in a very casual, slow-paced way and would have been ready. And that may be where a lot of people are frustrated because they're going to be doing content, or, you know, to unlock flying, they'd have to do it quick, and they'd have to be doing content that they're really not interested in. So, just keep, I'm not saying that that it's right, But that may be why so many people are, a lot of people are pissed off. So that's it for this one. This is a lot of talking for me. So I'm going to end this video. Let me know what you think about it. Are you looking forward to 6.2? Thank you for listening. And I will see you guys in the next one.